Well, here we go. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us at Secular AZ today. We are a nonprofit organization focused on protecting the Constitution and the separation of church and state for over a decade. We have great programming. And actually next weekend, we are going to be sharing a booth at the Phoenix Pride Festival with the Arizona chapter of Freedom from Religion Foundation. So stop by and see us. You can check out the t-shirts that we have for sale. We are running out of some sizes and colors, so come on down, find our booth, and if you want one, we have some really great t-shirts that help us with our fundraising. Next Wednesday, we have a Secretary of State candidate with a confirmed guest, Adrian Fontes, who is running for Secretary of State. And next Friday, October 13th at noon, we will be talking to Stephen Green, PhD, who is a professor of law and director of the Center for Religion, Law, and Democracy on Modern Day Comstock Laws. So that should be an interesting discussion as well. But today, we are talking to Dr. Seth Cotlar. Professor Cotlar specializes in the history of the United States in the years between the American Revolution and the Civil War. His first book, Tom Paine's America, The Rise and Fall of Transatlantic Radicalism in the Early Republic, won the Best First Book Prize from the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. He is currently working on a new book project, A Cultural History of Nostalgia in Modernizing America, 1776 to 1865. That's right up my alley, actually. My minor actually in college was history with a focus on American history. So welcome, Seth. Is there anything that I left out of your bio that you'd like to add?
No, I think that sounds good. And I should say that nostalgia project is sort of on the back burner right now. And I've started doing a lot more research, which I'm going to talk about today, on the far right in the Pacific Northwest, Oregon in particular, but also kind of more broadly, the relationship between the far right and the Republican Party and the far right and conservatism as we think about it.
Well, and that'll be right up everybody's alley. So without any further delay, please go ahead. If you need to share your screen, go ahead. I'm going to mute myself and I'll just pop on if somebody has a question. So if you do have any questions, feel free to put them into the Q&A and we'll answer them as we can.
Great, thank you. All right, well, welcome everyone. Even though I can't see you, hello. I will talk for maybe 30-40 minutes. I'm really eager to get questions from you all. Since I knew I was talking to a group from Arizona, I decided to dig into one little section of this project I'm working on that has an Arizona connection. So hopefully, and I'm still learning about Arizona political history. So if folks have memories or other things to share with me about John Conlin, who we will be talking about a bit today, please let me know. All right, so the subject as advertised was a kind of brief and selective history of the glide path from kind of normie church-going American conservative patriot to white supremacist activist who condones or engages in acts of domestic terrorism. And this gets at this question that has become a central important question for a lot of folks who write about and study the history of conservatism and the far right in the post-World War II era in the US, which is how should we think about the relationship between what we might consider the far right and conservatism? And so you have undoubtedly seen this meme that circulates frequently on social media, in which Barry Goldwater, a person who plays a very significant role that I will talk about in this history of the relationship between the far right and the GOP and the far right and conservatism, when he said, and I believe this is in the early 2000s that he said this, he said, "Mark my word, if and when these preachers get control of the Republican Party, and they're sure trying to do so, it's going to be a terrible damn problem. Frankly, these people frighten me. Politics and governing demand compromise, but these Christians believe they're acting in the name of God, so they can't and won't compromise. I know, I've tried to deal with them." So you've probably seen that before. What I'm going to talk about today is some of the context behind that comment that Barry Goldwater made. And so the story starts in Oregon with this man, Walter Huss. On the left, this is Walter Huss at the Rose Parade in Portland in 1961, On the right is Walter Huss running for office, which he did multiple times and never even came close to winning. And also Walter Huss with one of his great heroes, who was Dan Quayle, when Dan Quayle came to Portland for a fundraiser in the early 1990s. So Walter Huss is a figure who, if any of you have heard of him, I would be shocked because almost nothing has been written about him. He's pretty much a forgotten figure in the history of politics and the history of the right. But he did become the chair of the Oregon Republican Party in 1978 and made national headlines. And so we're going to talk a bit about him and his history as a far-right activist in Oregon, starting in the early 60s and extending into the 1990s and even early 2000s. And we're going to talk about John Conlin, who is a representative from Arizona, served, I believe it was 4 years in the House, for a while was talked about as a potential presidential candidate, akin to someone like Ronald Reagan, before it became clear that Reagan was going to be the favorite of the kind of conservative movement in 1980. Conlin was someone who was in that conversation. And I stumbled upon John Conlin, who I had never heard of before, when I was doing research in Walter Huss's papers, because he has a whole folder on John Conlin, which contains a ton of correspondence between him and Conlin in the years 1974 to 1976. And it's fascinating. And so to back up and put the bigger kind of framework of why this matters, thinking about politics in the US, it's important that we be mindful of the fact that every party is a coalition, especially in our kind of bipartisan system. Now, groups we might consider far-right populist, or what President Biden has recently called semi-fascist groups, are not new. They have always been a feature of the landscape of modern US politics, starting with the second Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s. When you read some of the literature and the newspapers of that second Klan from the 1920s, it talks about Christian nationalism. It talks about the need to keep out foreign immigrants who are a threat to American civilization. There are lots of themes in there. And likewise, they were an intentionally aggressive, intimidating kind of domestic terrorist organization that sought to kind of intimidate, whether it be Jews, Catholics, people of color, into silence, and to kind of reduce them to second-class citizenship. So from the second KKK of the 20s up through the Silver Shirts and the German-American Bund of the 30s, the John Birch Society of the 50s, the Minutemen of the 60s, the Posse Comitatus movement in the 70s and 80s, the Patriot and Militia movements of the 80s and the 90s, up through the Proud Boys, the 3% Militia, the Oath Keepers. So while these groups take different forms over time, have different ideological focuses, there's definitely a continuity that we can see there in terms of far-right political organization. And so I guess the first point I would make is to disabuse folks of the idea that, like, we're in this moment when, oh my gosh, where did all this far-right activism come from in American politics? We've never seen this before. We have seen it before. But there are a couple really important differences that I want to highlight. So now, one of the challenges that these far-right groups face is how to exert power through the political system. Especially given how generally unpopular, arguably un-American, many of their illiberal ideas have been. The idea that America belongs to Christian people alone, the idea that America belongs to white people, et cetera. Since the Civil War, the 14th Amendment, and so on, those have been profoundly, shall we say, marginal ideas. Okay. So in the 1950s, this coalition of far-right groups change their focus and begin focusing on trying to get a foothold in and then taking over the Republican Party. And in the 1950s, when this begins, in the early 60s, it is not at all clear that this is going to work. Right? The Republican Party was a really diverse coalition of people, many of whom were quite liberal on various social issues. And likewise, a lot of the nation's kind of far-right illiberals were Democrats in the South. They were the Dixiecrats, they were the segregationists. So the parties, in terms of how, as coalitions, were quite different. And so if you're on the far right, you could find allies in the Democratic Party in the South, and you could find allies in the kind of Republican Party in the Midwest, and in parts of the North. So I would argue that today's kind of MAGA movement that has kind of taken over the Republican Party is a kind of culmination of that 70-year far-right grassroots insurgency that starts in the 1950s and is always contested up through the 60s, 70s, 80s, even into the 90s and aughts. So someone like Steve Bannon or General Michael Flynn are just kind of the latest and most successful kind of leaders of this kind of longstanding far-right grassroots insurgency. And I use the word grassroots advisedly because it is authentically rooted in local churches and other kind of local organizations, but it is also coordinated nationally, not as some vast conspiracy, but through media networks that extend nationally. And obviously social media has made that type of translocal organization far easier to accomplish than it was back in the 1950s and 1960s. Okay, so this is where Barry Goldwater comes into the picture, because in the 1950s, as the far right looked for someone who would be the face of this movement at the level of national politics, Barry Goldwater was the person who everybody saw as the golden boy, as the person who could possibly do it. And of course, in hindsight, we know that Goldwater won the nomination for the Republican Party in 1964, but that was by no means a foregone conclusion in the late 50s and early 60s. It took a lot of concerted organizing and activism to accomplish that. So these are just some screenshots from a segregationist Southern newspaper called The Independent American, edited by the guy on the right, Kent Courtney. Kent Courtney was involved with the New Orleans Citizens Council in the 50s and 60s, and that was when David Duke was a young man. He would go to meetings of the New Orleans Citizens Council, and that's where he kind of cut his teeth as a political activist. So that gives you a flavor of the sort of organization they were. The picture on the left is Tom Anderson, who was a major figure in the John Birch Society, another kind of far-right populist, who eventually gives up on the Republican Party because he thinks it's too liberal under Ronald Reagan, just to give you a sense of what his politics were. And he pushes kind of a third party, kind of far right. But in the late 50s and early 60s, Tom Anderson was very much on the Barry Goldwater bandwagon. The person to Tom Anderson's left there is Robert Welch, the founder of the John Birch Society, with which you're probably familiar. One of the things that they did in order to get Barry Goldwater on the national scene is they had him write a book called The Conscience of a Conservative, which you can see this is the original edition, the first edition, which was from Victor Publishing Company in Shepherdsville, Kentucky, a very small outlet. The person who ran that outlet was a guy named Leo Reardon, who was the business manager for Clarence Mannion, who was a really significant AM radio figure on the right in the 1950s and early 60s. Clarence Mannion was the former dean of Notre Dame Law School. He was also one of the kind of leaders of the draft Goldwater movement. Now, Leo Reardon, who was the person behind this idea of having Goldwater write this book, Leo Reardon has an interesting history. I won't read all of this to you. But Leo Reardon was the business manager for Father Coughlin in the 1930s, who was a fascist radio announcer who reached an audience of 15 to 30 million, historians have estimated. And Reardon was actually sent to Germany, to Nazi Germany, by Coughlin in the 30s, where he met with Goebbels and with Ribbentrop to try to arrange some kind of relationship between Coughlin and the US and the Nazi government. It didn't end up really going anywhere, but just to give you a flavor of these genealogies that connect Barry Goldwater to Coughlin and the fascists of the 1930s. So this is not to say that Barry Goldwater was a fascist. It's just that it is of interest, and people observing at the time, people who were observers of the far right at the time, noted that Barry Goldwater seemed to have all kinds of really kind of fishy looking ties in his organization to some fairly far right folks. Another point that I would make about The Conscience of a Conservative, which isn't necessarily well known, is that it was ghostwritten by Brent Bozell, who is William F. Buckley's brother-in-law. Brent Bozell was late in getting the book to the printer, in part because he was living in Spain, because he chose to live there because he thought Franco's regime in Spain was a preferable alternative to living in what he perceived to be a kind of semi-communist United States. So later in his life, Brent Bozell would write, would start a magazine that was basically an Americanized version of Francoism that he was advocating for. Small little tidbit is that Brent Bozell's grandson actually was one of the people who invaded the Capitol on January 6th, but obviously the original Brent Bozell is not responsible for what his grandson did. Okay, so when Goldwater gets the nomination in 1964, that convention in Oakland, California was a pretty notorious and infamous event. Jackie Robinson, for example, who was a lifelong Republican, it should be noted, he described the atmosphere of that convention as, quote, "I now believe I know how it felt to be a Jew in Hitler's Germany." Bob Novak, who some of you may remember as a kind of center-right political commentator in the 80s, from the 60s up through the aughts. Bob Novak wrote a book called The Agony of the GOP that was a reflection on the 1964 Republican convention, and it has an entire chapter called The White Man's Party, in which he makes the case that, in essence, this is what the GOP chose in 1964, and he interviews a bunch of grassroots, rank and file activists in the party who made it clear to him that it wasn't just that they didn't support the Civil Rights Act for constitutional principled reasons, but that there were also a significant number of people who were invested in this for white nationalist reasons. Okay. And so, as I'm sure many of you know, Barry, there's that famous line, you hunt go hunting where the ducks are. And he won. He got shellacked in that election in 1964 by Lyndon Johnson. And the only states he won, apart from Arizona, were 5 states of the former Confederacy, which was not at all a coincidence. So in 1959, so starting really early, Barry Goldwater had made the decision that he was going to court that segregationist portion of the electorate, and so he granted an interview to the Citizens Council Radio Hour in 1959. I'm just going to play a little bit of it just so you get the flavor. And just so that we're clear on that, some people would say, oh, well, Goldwater didn't know necessarily what he was doing. He knew full well what he was doing. Sorry, I'm trying to get this now to work. Here we go.
This is the Citizens Council Forum, the American viewpoint with a Southern accent, presented by the Citizens Councils of America on behalf of affiliated state organizations throughout the South. The Citizens Councils are dedicated to states' rights and racial integrity, to individual liberty, and to race relations based on common sense, not on the power politics of left-wing pressure groups. The Citizens Councils are primarily a means of mobilizing public opinion. Informed people will not surrender their freedom. Now, from Washington, here is your host for Citizens Council Forum, Dick Morphew.
Hello again, everyone, and welcome to today's edition of Citizens Council Forum. We're very happy to have with us as our guest today, Senator Barry Goldwater, a Republican from Arizona. Senator Goldwater is a member of the Labor.
Right, you get the idea. We won't let, if you'd like, you can find this if you Google it. Mississippi State has a huge archive of the Citizens Council of Mississippi's radio shows and so on. Okay, so I don't want to spend too much longer on Barry Goldwater. So one of Goldwater's most avid supporters in Oregon was the person I'm researching, this guy named Walter Huss. Walter Huss was a Foursquare minister. He was a lifelong anti-communist crusader and a conspiracy enthusiast. I don't want to call him a theorist because there really was no basis for any of his theories, but he really was into his conspiracies. And he was a conservative activist who was elected chair of the Oregon Republican Party in 1978. One thing that I've learned from dipping into Huss's files, and I'll talk more about this, is that he had very close ties to white nationalists, Christian identity preachers, and far-right domestic terrorists, including neo-Nazis. He was, in other words, a semi-fascist, if not an outright fascist. He was also a Holocaust denier, and so on. So in 1964, he ran an Oregonians for Goldwater campaign that he kind of, was interesting, he sort of freebooted it. It ran parallel to the Oregon Republican Party's kind of weak institutional effort. The Oregon Republican Party was generally more moderate and liberal, and so they weren't completely thrilled about Barry Goldwater. And so Walter Huss kind of ran his own show. He did it in part to make money because he sold literature and flags and things like that. But in 1964, Barry Goldwater came to Oregon once for a campaign stop, and Walter Huss went to the airport to greet him. And the official head of the Oregon Republican Party was there too. And he looked at Walter Huss and he said, "Wait, who are you? Like, what are you doing here?" He's like, "I'm the head of Oregonians for Goldwater." And the guy was like, "Wait a minute, I'm the chair of the Oregon. What are you talking about?" Anyway, Barry Goldwater kind of walked off the plane and shook hands with both of them and went about his way. So another interesting thing about Walter Huss is that in 1964, before he got on the Goldwater bandwagon, he was stumping for George Wallace. And in 1968, he completely rejected Nixon and also was very avidly working for George Wallace. And George Wallace, who was the sort of famous segregationist governor of Alabama, who was running as an independent in 68. So starting in 1968, Walter Huss began recruiting people across the state in churches mostly, and he was encouraging them to run for precinct captain. And the idea was that he would get people from every state in the county from their churches, these kind of far-right figures, to run for precinct captain. And as he pointed out, you only need 3 votes to win. And hardly anybody runs. And so usually if you just put your name on the ballot, you'll win. And so he attempted this for 10 years, from 1968, 70, 72, 74, 76. Every 2 years, he would show up at the convention. He would try to win the chairmanship. He would fall short, but every year he got more and more and more votes. And then finally in 1978, he succeeded and he took over the Oregon Republican Party. This is just a fun little piece. I found out that he wrote a song with a guy named James Bissell on behalf of Barry Goldwater called "The Gold Rush Is On." It's a terrible song. It is on YouTube if you want to find it. I tracked down someone who had a copy of it, who ripped it and put it onto YouTube. But my favorite part about this is that it was his co-author, James Bissell, was a Christian ventriloquist with a dummy named Tony. This is our man, Jim Bissell. And he and Huss were friends into the 1990s. Jim Bissell was going around to various nursing homes and so on in the Portland area, singing sort of rabidly Islamophobic and homophobic songs to entertain elderly folks in Portland in the 1980s and 1990s.
So real quick, first
Yeah.
of all, that is the stuff that Nightmares is made out of right
Okay.
there on the screen. Thank you for not making us listen to the song. And then third, there is a question here from Diane Post, who's our head of legal, and she says, "I recall when Oregon was called the Mississippi of the West. Now it's a liberal state. How did that change?" But I feel like you're going to tell us how it's starting to change back. Am I right? Okay.
Well, maybe, I don't know. That's a fantastic question.
Yeah.
And that's why I think Walter Huss's story is hugely significant, because there are a couple different parts of this. First is, how did Oregon, that was the Mississippi of the West, which was a pretty racially exclusionary state, become a more liberal state? And that's an incredibly complicated story. Part of the story is around moderate Republicans like Senator Mark Hatfield and Senator Bob Packwood, who ended his career in a very bad place, but up to that point, when he was kind of revealed to be a serial sexual harasser, he was known as a supporter of women's rights. He was pro-ERA, he was pro-choice. Mark Hatfield made his career in the 1960s as an opponent of the Vietnam War. Both Mark Hatfield and Bob Packwood were strong advocates of civil rights and multiracial democracy. So, our Republican governor in the 1970s was a guy named Tom McCall, who was a real pioneer in terms of passing environmental legislation. The bottle bill was his idea. He made the entire coast of Oregon public property so that no private individuals could own any part of the Oregon coast. And he also did the legislation around limiting development in Oregon cities. So that for many years, especially in the 70s and into the early 80s, Oregon's Republican Party had a well-justified reputation for being quite moderate, if not liberal. And part of what happened is that Walter Huss and his kind of grassroots far-right, very kind of evangelical Christian activists who comprised, maybe 30 to 40% of the Oregon electorate. So not an insignificant number, but certainly not a majority. What they did is they succeeded in taking over the Oregon Republican Party and pushing it way to the right. So the Oregon Republican Party in the 1980s became a party that was focused primarily on anti-LGBTQ legislation and focused on pro-life, kind of radical pro-life politics, which basically took them out of the mainstream of Oregon sort of public opinion and rendered them pretty much electorally unviable. So the last time Oregon voted for a Republican to be the governor was 1982. 40 years ago was the last time Oregon voters voted for a Republican to be governor. I'm hoping that doesn't change. We don't break that trend this year. We shall see what will happen. Yeah, so that's my general sense of how Oregon, so part of Oregon's reputation as a liberal state has to do with the particularities of Eugene and Portland, and that kind of sort of middle-class white liberalism that dominates those two places. But there's also a part of the story that involves the Oregon Republican Party just basically driving itself off the map of political viability in the 1980s and 90s in the name of kind of purity around these culture war issues that, in some states that would work and that would play and would get you elected. In Oregon, it did not, and in fact had the opposite effect. But interestingly enough, the Oregon Republican Party has never really changed course, right? There hasn't been the moment when the Oregon Republican Party has said like, maybe we're like out in the woods here and we need to tack to the middle in order to make ourselves more relevant and appealing to general voters. That has yet to happen, but who knows what the future holds. All right, I'm happy to take other questions as well, but I'll let you kind of decide how you want to proceed.
I mean, as they come in, I will share them. I just thought that maybe that would be one that would be specific to this part. So yeah, we'll go ahead and post them in the chat or in the Q&A, and I'll share them with you as they seem relevant.
Excellent, thank you. So anyway, so Walter Huss is this guy, and I'm the first person to look at his archive. There are 57 boxes of his materials at the University of Oregon special collections. I'm the first person to look at them, and I thought they would be bad based upon what I knew about Walter Huss. And frankly, they are like way worse than I could have ever imagined. So from the public record, you would know that Walter Huss was a pretty conservative guy who maybe had some like iffy ideas about Jews and Black people. And when you get into the archive, you discover that, yeah, no, he was a straight up neo-Nazi. I mean, these are just a few pictures. He had enormous files just labeled Jews that contained every, the protocols of the Elders of Zion, every kind of anti-Semitic tract you can imagine, many of which were kind of marked up, underlined, et cetera. And these stretch back to the 50s. 60s, 70s. This was a lifelong obsession of his. And another creepy part of his Jews folder is that he seems to have clipped stories from the Oregonian anytime a Jewish person was mentioned. And it has a little bit of a feel of a hit list almost. And so his kind of pathological obsession with Jews and also with African Americans who advocated for civil rights is quite a significant part of who he was and his identity, though he was smart enough to kind of keep that kind of on the down low whenever he would present himself publicly. Okay. So this is and part of the reason why I'm able to get access to this part of Oregon's political history is because Walter Huss was not the most, shall we say, kind of organized and efficacious person, though he had a ton of energy. He was like the Energizer bunny of just far-right horribleness. And the way that these papers ended up at the University of Oregon is that someone in Portland knew of Huss as he was dying, contacted the U of O, said, look, I know you collect political papers. There's this guy who I know, and he's been involved with this since the 60s. I'll bet he has a ton of stuff. You might want to get in touch with him. And so they went to his house in 2005, about a year before he died, and he was about to be taken to a nursing home. So he was in the living room in a hospital bed, kind of delirious and out of it, as the archivist came to his house and just threw everything they could into boxes. And as they were doing it, he apparently was in the other room screaming, there's money, there's money, there's money in the folders. And the poor kind of undergrad there who was putting this stuff together was looking through and said, sir, I don't know, I can't find it. Do you know where it is? And he didn't know. Anyway, I found it. There it is on the left. As I was going through the archives in some random folder for Barbara Roberts, who was an Oregon politician, there were these envelopes and I opened them up and there were $7,500 in crisp $100 bills. Which is not a usual experience one has when one is in the archive. And as you'll see on the right, this is just a picture of one representative box, which includes topics from colon and coffee delight, which is a non-dairy creamer, to communism, lots of stuff about communism, conditioners for your hair, the Constitution, and Christopher Columbus, of course. And also buried in there, which you can't see, is the folder for John Conlon, our Arizona connection. So John Conlon in 1974 and 1975 was trying to create, he was working with Bill Bright from the Campus Crusade for Christ, and they were trying to create a national evangelical political organization that would bring together evangelical Christians and bring them into politics in a more kind of forceful way. And so Walter Huss went to one of these meetings early on in 1974. And so Conlon writes to him, just a note to say how delighted I was to meet the two of you and to share our common concerns as Christians and patriots for America. I appreciated our conversation so very much and look forward to working closely with you in the coming months. I've asked Bob Jones to give you a call and get together for lunch someday. This is the Bob Jones, the head of Bob Jones University. Bob Jones University, as you may or may not know, banned interracial dating until the year 2000. So
I'm sorry to interrupt real quick,
Sure.
but there's just there's a lot of curiosity about that money on Facebook.
Oh, okay.
And so people are asking, what happened to all the money? Haha,
Yeah.
that's from O'Brien Sam.
Yeah.
Sandy is
Sure.
asking, where do you think the money came from? And then
Right.
Sandy's also, she wants to know what happened with the money.
Yeah. It is a really bizarre story. So the money was just treasury bonds that he had redeemed. So there's nothing salacious or exciting about it. And the money, what happened to it is that it went to the archive. They're trying to find his descendants. Unclear if any of them are still alive, because rightfully the money would belong to them. And if not, then the archive will put it to some good, appropriate use. So anyway,
so no shopping sprees.
No shopping sprees. I mean, yeah. When I found it and I told my parents about it. My dad was like, "Why didn't you pocket it?" I was like, "Come on, that's can't do that. There's this whole, professional ethics thing.
It's really good to know that we are speaking with someone who has some modicum of civility and some integrity. So thank you for your moral compass.
Well, sure. I mean, yeah, it was, I would be lying if I didn't say it didn't occur to me like, oh my gosh, wow, I could sure use $7,500, but it did not seem like the right thing to do. It was, so my sense was, so he was an incredibly paranoid person throughout his entire life, but especially towards the end of his life, he became exceptionally paranoid, and didn't trust banks. He had multiple guns that he owned. He went to several kind of survivalist training camps with Bo Greitz. I don't know if you remember Bo Greitz, militia guy from the early 90s, late 80s. Anyway, so Walter Huss in his 70s is going to these survivalist camps to learn how to shoot guns and bulletproof his house. And so because he didn't really trust banks, because again, this is connected to the anti-Semitism, he assumed that the Jews would somehow take all of his money. And so he had a ton of his money in gemstones. I'm not sure whatever happened to those, but apparently he owned a lot of gemstones. He also was a complete sucker for just about every get-rich scheme you could imagine. He was involved with dozens or scores of multi-level marketing schemes, most of which seem to have ripped him off. So anyway, another way in which he was not necessarily the most kind of economically rational and efficacious person. But this money were some treasury bonds. I don't know where they originated from, but the money, the cash, was in a envelope that named the treasury bonds and had a receipt for having redeemed them. So I'm assuming that's where that came from. All right, so yeah, sorry. Whenever I talk about the money, everybody wants to know about the money because it's a fascinating story. And also I should say, this is why a lot of his contemporaries were like, Walter Huss, that dude is just a kook. Like, why would anybody be interested in him? Why would anybody care about him? And hopefully I'm sort of making the case for why, even though he was, pretty out there in a whole host of ways, and didn't succeed by his own terms in his own time, the kind of brand of politics and the style of organizing that he pioneered, or didn't pioneer, but was involved with in the 1970s, is basically the model that today's kind of local far right, the local GOP organizations, et cetera, are following. Okay. So, and this is a letter that then Huss sent to Conlon. And I don't know if you can read all of it, but the part that I want to really focus on is on the right on page 2. And he's talking about how he wants to create this program called the Key People Program. And he says, and he admits that it'll probably be secret, right? That we don't really want the public to know that we're doing this. The Key People Program can actually, in 2 years' time, place a key person for each of the 50 states, a key person for each of the 435 congressional districts, and a key person for each of the 3,000 counties, and at least 2 key people for each of the 175,000 precincts, who, in turn, will place at least 10 key people in charge of the blocks or areas in that precinct. This organized, trained force, and his use of the word force here is interesting. He was also a real advocate of gun rights, and also himself had all kinds of connections to violent, armed right-wing militias. But anyway, this organized, trained force of 50 plus 435 plus 3,000 plus 175,000 times 2 plus 175,000 times 10 is the only known means to reach every home in America in one evening or in any day for any reason, be it political, evangelical, survival, educational, etc. Knowing what can happen in the days ahead, such as a political strike, a food shortage, a military blackmail, a Holocaust, a revolution, a change of government seat, a threat of economic collapse, or whatever, it is comforting to know that the nation would have this informed, trained body to act as a unifying, stabilizing, mollifying force for whatever the need. This will be the preserving salt on a, my goodness, saturation basis. Anyway, So the idea, it's basically what the communists did. He was obsessed with communism, and it's basically a kind of Leninist model of cell organization, but to take it from the very local, like the level of individual blocks, up to the county, up to the precinct, up to the state, up to the nation. And this is in the 70s, so this is obviously before the internet. But he's trying to imagine ways in which media and other forms of communication can knit together what is perceived to be this kind of, this is like the moral majority is until 1979, but this is a kind of seedbed of what would become this moral majority vision, this idea that the good Christian patriots of America are the real Americans, but they're just dispersed and disorganized. And so if we just get people together, we can kind of enforce our will upon an American public that has fallen away from the true patriotic vision of what the United States should be, according to them. So Conlin, one interesting thing about Conlin is that Goldwater hated Conlin, and he thought he was a total anti-Semite, and he had good reason to believe that. But usually when the story is told, it's just like, oh, he did this one thing where he pointed out that his opponent was Jewish, and some people thought that was anti-Semitic, but he said, oh, I was just, whatever, he is Jewish, I was just saying that. Doesn't mean anything. The fact that Conlin was so closely tied to Walter Huss, and what I've told you about who Walter Huss is and what he believed and what he thought, especially when he unburdened himself to the people who he thought he could trust. I think Barry Goldwater, I think his senses were pretty much accurate. So I just want to quickly bring the tentacles, right? So that this conservative far-right coalition is forming, and it contains all kinds of people, right? Including Barry Goldwater, including John Conlin, including Walter Huss, including a whole bunch of people. One of the people who I've stumbled upon, and there are dozens of people like this who I've found in Walter Huss's papers, is just this guy, Edward Hayman, for example. And Edward Hayman was a independent Christian minister from mostly all over the country, but then he settled in Gladstone, Oregon. He was really into alternative medicine, as was Walter Huss, by the way. Really interestingly, he did not trust modern medicine and was selling basically alternative foods. In the 80s, he made his money selling alternative medicine and alternative organic food to hippies in Portland who he hated and thought were communists. That's how he made his money. But when we think about the anti-vax stuff today and how that connects to sort of far-right politics, Walter Huss was there already, as was Edward Hayman in the 1970s and 1980s. So Hayman later becomes involved with the Posse Comitatus movement. And the Posse Comitatus movement was a radically violent anti-government organization. This is a quote of, from Hayman in 1983, where he says, "Do you know what they're doing with all the small farms in South Dakota, North Dakota, and Minnesota?" He said, the communist Jews bankers are taking them over. So this was the worldview of Edward Hayman. And here's a letter that Hayman sent to Walter Huss in 1988. And I just want to draw attention to a couple things here. So it starts with him talking about getting these like alternative medicine treatments and so on. And then he goes on to say, "Now you will please tell your friends they can recover and that you will use the sign of the fish and not the Talmud, as so many do in serving us kosher goods." I'm not entirely clear what that means, but it's clearly anti-Semitic. And then he talks about this guy, Everett Thorin, who is another Posse Comitatus member who is arrested for blowing up a potato shed in Eastern Oregon in the late 1970s. Everett Thorin had been a Republican candidate for office in the 1960s who ran with Walter Huss on a ticket with Walter Huss many times. If you look on the right, you'll see the name of Kenneth Goff. Kenneth Goff was a white nationalist Christian identity preacher and who was involved with the Minutemen, which was a far-right domestic terror organization with links to fascists. And Huss had taken Kenneth Goff on a speaking tour across multiple places in the state of Oregon in 1963. And so Goff is one of these interesting far-right figures who was usually considered to be outside the boundaries. But here is Hayman reflecting on this guy who 25 years ago, presumably he and Huss had met with and had hung out with in Oregon. Then if you go further down on the right side, This is the close, right, where he says, those in corrupt government are killing and shooting Christians and sending them to jail as they try to silence top military retired officers from the military, from General Douglas MacArthur's men like William Gale, who's William Potter Gale, who was a Christian, the founder of Christian identity theology, which is an explicitly racist white nationalist Christian tradition. And now Richard Butler. Butler's name may be familiar to you. He was one of the heads of the Aryan Nation in Idaho, who kept out the traitors in the aircraft, etc. So here is this, and Walter and Edward Heyman was a minister. He ran a church in Gladstone, Oregon. He held summer camps for Bible study classes, etc. In the 70s and 80s. And he was very much a fascist, as was Walter Huss. And so this is where we can see these ties that connect someone like John Conlon, who is an elected member of the House of Representatives, to this kind of subterranean world of violent far-right domestic terrorists. And there are obviously distinctions to be made between people who would actually engage in violence. I have no evidence that either Heyman or Huss actually engaged in political violence, but clearly they were tied to a whole bunch of people who did, and were very comfortable with the idea that this is something that one was called to do in the name of patriotism and in the name of Christ. So to go back to where we started, these are the kind of people that Barry Goldwater was thinking about when he was talking about this threat to the Republican Party. And in part, you know, he helped make it happen, Barry Goldwater. But at least towards the end of his life, he had the kind of foresight to see that maybe this was not such a great coalition that he was a part of. All right, let me end there because I want to take some questions if folks have questions.
There are no questions so far, so I'll just remind everybody, both on Facebook and in the webinar, if you do have any questions, please go ahead. We do have a comment from Lindsay, and she says, sounds like a precursor to Project Blitz. Sure does. There's a ton of parallels here.
Now, tell me about Project Blitz. I'm not familiar with that.
This is Steve Bannon's, right? Is it Steve Bannon or Alec? But, you know, one of those groups, basically just trying to, you know, full court attack on state legislatures, full court attack on school boards. You know, I like how too you said something about how they kind of portrayed themselves as grassroots. And that's what these, you know, since the Tea Party started infiltrating school boards back in 2010, they would portray themselves as well as like, oh, we're patriots and the Tea Party movement, and this is a grassroots, but no, it was all AstroTurf, you know?
Yeah, and it was, I mean, it was, I use the term GastroTurf, which maybe isn't great, but it's like, because there certainly are AstroTurf groups out there. But the way it works, at least in Oregon, was that there really were kind of local, very small kind of organizations that had been around for a long time, that truly were, you know, sort of authentically invested in this kind of far-right politics. And then you have folks who kind of come in either who have a kind of national platform or fame of some sort in the media, or people with a lot of money who sort of can come in. Though a lot of these groups are funded by local kind of grandees, right? In Oregon, the far right was funded for years by a guy named Courtwright Ames, who owned a small chemical factory south of Salem. And, you know, he didn't have a ton of money, but he had millions of dollars. And so millions of dollars will go a long way in state politics in Oregon. And so he was an important figure in kind of bringing together these groups like the John Birch Society and the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys and other groups like that. And one of their main tactics was to find what we might think of as like soft targets, like a school board, a local school board, or, you know, a local police board or something where they know that most citizens are not going to be paying attention. And they gather 10, 20, 30 people, that's all it takes, right? Who will go and will cause a ruckus and will scream and, you know, and that's all it takes to really kind of throw a monkey wrench in the workings of our just kind of daily grinding sort of process of governing ourselves as a nation. So Huss was a master of this. Like one of the first things that he did when he arrived in Oregon is that he started a campaign to convince people that UNICEF was a communist front organization, and the school children around Oregon would take around a box at Halloween to collect money to feed poor children around the world through UNICEF. And in newspapers across the state, all these people wrote in after Halloween and they were like, wait, my kid went trick-or-treating and like went to a couple of houses and got yelled at by someone about how they were collecting money for communists. And it's like, my kid's not collecting money for communists. They're just like, they have a bucket to raise money to help feed poor children. But Walter Huss was the guy who seeded this idea in various communities around Oregon and created this situation where like little kids went up to a door and got a talking to by someone about how they were helping further the communist conspiracy. So it's not true.
Yeah, I mean, I've had similar experiences knocking on doors for local, campaigns. And my background is in education. And, when I tell people that I'm an educator, it used to be like, thank you so much for being a teacher. But now I've been called all kinds of things. I'm a groomer, I'm a pedophile, I'm a whatever, they say these things. And I'm just I'm really blown away by it. And the same thing, I've talked to a few healthcare workers, since COVID, and the way that they've been treated. We are the heroes on the ground, or we used to be, but now like, oh gosh, we can't even be trusted. It's a very strange timeline that we exist on. I do have a couple of similar questions here. So Deborah and Diane were both kind of talking a little bit about Liz Cheney. And so Deborah says, considering that these Christian nationalist ideologies that were brewing since the 1950s have come to complete fruition in MAGA Republicans, is there any hope for the Cheney-Kinzinger Republicans to regain the GOP?
Well, I mean, I don't have a crystal ball. I mean, I would say it would probably be better for even though I don't share their policy preferences, it would be better for our democracy if they did. But I don't foresee that happening anytime soon. I mean, to my mind, the scenario that might work would be one in which the current iteration of the Republican Party just becomes electorally unviable, not just in California, Oregon, multiple blue states, but then nationwide. So if, for example, let's say in Florida and in Georgia and in Texas, like if Beto O'Rourke wins in Texas and Warnock wins in Georgia and Stacey Abrams wins in Georgia and Charlie Crist wins in Florida and Val Demings wins in Florida, I would assume that the National Republican Party would have a pretty serious reckoning with what Donald Trump has wrought and what he's done to them. But short of, and even if that happens, I'm not even sure that would make a difference. I mean, the last 40 years of the history of the Republican Party in Oregon is that they just keep losing and losing again and again. And rather than talking to the center, there's some forces trying to drag them that direction, but for the most part, it's kind of a lost cause. And like in California, it's not as if, the California Republican Party used to dominate politics in that state. And then, thanks to Pete Wilson and the anti-immigrant stuff of the 90s and so on. And so rather than the California Republican Party tacking to the center, it seems to have gotten even just more extreme. So, what you would think would be the incentive structure that would drive parties to seek out to win. And this is why when you combine that situation with all of these kind of efforts, as you all know, in Arizona, to basically just steal elections by just making stuff up. And so that is one way in which you can retain political power without having to actually win more votes, is if you do things like what Mark Fincham has kind of called for and so on. Or I believe in Michigan, and also the governor of Pennsylvania, guy running for governor, Doug Mastriano, similarly, will just decide that a Republican has won Pennsylvania, regardless of how the voters actually vote. So that's the scenario that I think is really terrifying.
And I believe too, the concerted effort by Mitch McConnell to appoint as many conservative judges to the bench as he possibly could. This what we always had thought was like this reliable, unbiased arm of government has now become clearly political. And I think that, this is just me talking out loud here, but like, it does seem that they are confident and that whatever they decide to put forward, the courts are going to support them, because so far, since Trump's presidency, that is what we've seen. I do have another question here from Aaron. And Aaron says, there is a John Birch Society chapter in my town. Any tips on how to counter message them or talk to people who may not know their true intentions or purpose?
That's a great question. I mean, it's important work, but I'm always of two minds about this, in the sense that, I mean, it is such a fringe and marginal organization that to some extent, drawing attention to them is exactly what they want, and actually sometimes ends up kind of giving them more credence than they deserve. On the other hand, the stuff that they're spreading, John Birch Society has been spreading all kinds of really dangerous anti-vax stuff and is totally on board with the election denial messaging. So in that sense, it is what they're doing is politically sort of toxic and dangerous. But for the most part, what the history of the far right has tried to do is to just become part of the conversation. That is their goal, right? To just be treated like any other part of our political discourse. And if they have done that, then they have succeeded. And that to me is the real challenge in doing it, because so someone like Walter Huss, for example, he thought that Jewish people and Black people did not belong in America, right? Like you can't, that is not part of like a national conversation in a constitutional democracy. That is not a position where you should sit down and have a debate about that, right? That is just a starting fundamental premise. And so once you to give up this idea that our political conversation should start from just a set of really basic, not necessarily controversial assumptions about who we are, or, the John Birch Society starts from an assumption that there's an international conspiracy, probably of Jews, right, that runs the world and is seeking to turn the United States into a kind of, a colony of slaves run by the international banking elite. It's completely batshit crazy. Right. So once you start you can't have like a rational argument with folks who just their fundamental worldview is completely detached from the empirical reality of how the world is working. So
they're cult members at this point, and in the past we've had conversations with people who have escaped cults, whether we're talking about like, they were on a commune and secluded from everybody, or just being in one of those far right evangelical churches where they have to do some serious deprogramming. And so if my neighbor who's flying, 10 flags, I'm not going to, I just know that I'm not going to be able to have a rational conversation with them.
Right. It's years and years. It's not the kind of thing that they're all of a sudden they're going to go, gosh, you're right. I'm going to stop going to the John Birch Society. It's incredibly hard. And so that's why, I think of one of the key things we can do is talking to friends and people in our churches and neighbors who aren't in that world, but who don't necessarily follow it and aren't particularly aware. And so just for an example, I had a couple people in my social circles who shared something with me from the Epoch Times newspaper that was kind of vaccine denial stuff. And I was like, wait, and they were like, hey, have you seen this? Well, I hadn't heard about this before. I was like, okay, do you know what the Epoch Times is? Right. And they didn't. And there's no reason why they should, right? There's no reason why any ordinary citizen who's not paying a ton of attention to politics should know about this. And so that's where, and then once I told them, they were like, oh, okay, thanks. Yeah, this sounded a little weird, but I didn't know anything about it. And then they just like threw it away. Right. And so so this is where like distinguishing between, what is the kind of ballpark of, disagreement and debate and argument in which, there's evidence that can support what it is are different positions on something like how to deal with climate change, for example, right? There's a range of opinions, what the best solutions might be and how we should approach this. But the idea that like it doesn't exist is like, there's no conversation to be had there because they don't even acknowledge that it even is a problem. So that's where, to me, like a lot of these groups on the far right, that they've just basically hived off a chunk of the population into this alternate universe in which climate change doesn't exist, in which, COVID is a conspiracy cooked up by the Chinese, vaccines don't work, and I don't even know where you go.
Well, and it makes me think too. I mean, I remember seeing the documentary film Noam Chomsky Manufactured Consent, and that was like, I don't know, back in the 90s or early 2000s, and he was talking about Fox News and that echo chamber and how this is going to be the destruction, and he wasn't even really thinking about social media. And now I don't remember the exact statistic, but the number of Americans that get their news from their friends' Facebook posts, or other social media outlets is staggering, because we've all, kind of, fenced ourselves into these little echo chambers. And so you're going to see and hear exactly what fits into what the algorithms tell you want to see and hear. And now, with True Social and Gab and Parler and all these other ones, they're really off in their own little world and their own little realities. And, we have people in our legislature and in Congress who are self-proclaimed oath keepers, and we have school board members in Deer Valley who identify as 3%ers, who are getting endorsements from people who are running for the legislature. I mean, we are in a strange space. And here in Maricopa County, and then there's Pima County where Tucson is, we tend to be like those more liberal cities. But the rest of the state, you go to Payson, Arizona, or some of these other places, and there are whole fortresses that seem to be dedicated to the former president. Very strange. Very strange.
Yeah. No, and that's where like the guardrails, the institute that, so a lot of political scientists argue that we're living in an era of weak parties, but incredibly intense partisanship, so that people's partisan identities have become ever more kind of powerful and meaningful to them, but the parties as institutions have far less power to actually gatekeep and so on. So that, there's that famous tweet from Lindsey Graham in March of 2016, where he said, if we nominate Donald Trump, we will be destroyed and we will deserve it. It's still up on Twitter, which blows me away. But so, the entire GOP establishment thought Trump was completely anathema, right? And they were terrified, and they just assumed that this would be a terrible thing for him and the Republican Party and the country. But he won, and they did not have the power to stop it, right? And so this is where these kind of, grassroots far-right insurgent energies that have been rising inside the Republican Party, ebbing and flowing since the 50s, right, since the 60s. What's new is that they've pretty much taken over this institution, and our parties are incredibly powerful and potent and influential entities, and so it's kind of like I wouldn't say it's a hostile takeover exactly, but it's a takeover where the people, there's a good number of Republicans who aren't pleased about it, like Kinzinger and Cheney and Lisa Murkowski and Mitt Romney and Susan Collins and so on, and probably many more who are afraid to speak out about it. They just don't have any tools at their disposal to really do anything about it, or if they were to do something about it, they would lose. And the party would lose, right? And so
exactly, all of our, every except for one legislative candidate, all of the moderate Republicans, and they're not even really all that moderate, but everyone who is considered to be a moderate, including Rusty Bowers, who is the former Speaker of the House, he testified to the January 6th committee. He lost his bid, as did every other quote unquote moderate Republican. And if that's being moderate, then I don't really want any part of it. But they were beaten by hardcore, MAGA Trump Republicans, and I think it'll be really, really interesting to see what happens in Arizona. I know the eyes of the country are on Arizona this election cycle, because we do have some of the most radical candidates at the school board level, at the legislative level, at the city council level, at the state level. So we have election deniers who are running like crazy. And so I think basically the overarching message today of everything that you talked about is we truly need all hands on deck, and everybody should try to find somebody to support in their area who will combat this kind of, racist, white nationalist extremism.
Right.
That's my takeaway.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I would also say that, the fact that it is so deeply embedded, so when I read Walter Haas's papers from the 60s and 70s, it's like today. I mean, there's so much. It's just like, if I were to line up all of his policy positions, they would pretty much line up with what Wendy Rogers or Carrie Lake stand for, right? Only translated into the 21st century. So it's not as if this stuff is brand new and just sprung up, in the last 5 years. Trump is not responsible for this. He did not create this, which also means it's not, if Trump goes away, if the Republican Party loses, it's not like this kind of far right political culture is just going to vanish. It's not going to go away. So this is where, to me, the key point is not so much that there are folks who inhabit that world and that worldview. And I have very little faith that a lot of them will actually change. What matters is that small but substantial minority of Americans have basically succeeded in taking over one of our two major political parties. And it's that party and what it does that really is consequential. And so to the extent that there are Republicans out there, this is why, like, if I had my way, if I could control Liz Cheney and what she did, she should be out on the road campaigning for Kelly in Arizona. She should be, campaigning for Carrie Lake's opponent in Arizona. She should be campaigning so there's a district in Western Washington, where a total MAGA guy is running for Congress. Liz Cheney should be out there advocating, because hers is a voice that can be heard by those the remaining kind of moderates and independents. And I don't know if she's going to do that, or if people like her are going to do it. But those are the kind of voices that might be able to actually reach some of the voters who really are kind of on the fence, even though that's a very small number.
Well, and we have seen here in Arizona, a lot of folks, either Republicans, people who were once elected or, affiliated in some way or another with the Republican Party, have now come out to support people like, the Secretary of State candidate, Adrian Fontes, our governor candidate, Katie Hobbs. So there are people, at least from the state of Arizona, from many decades past, who have kind of come out. Right. So, I mean, it is happening, but, I'm on pins and needles. Let's see, I have it written down on my calendar, 32 days until the election, everybody. So, and then Diane says that Cheney was here promoting Hobbs. So she is apparently coming out and promoting some of these candidates. So anyway, we are over time. I'm so sorry, everybody, for going over time, but this was such a great talk. I kind of didn't want it to end. So if you want to point us maybe in the direction of your Twitter, I just started following you on Twitter, or any other, when your books are going to be coming out, any of that kind of stuff, please share it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm on Twitter under my name, Seth Cotlar, so I'm easy to find there. And I'm working on an article about this guy, Walter Haas, who I talked about. I don't know whether John Conlon is going to make the cut and will make it in. He might, yeah. So that hopefully that'll be in the works or out next summer, and then maybe it'll be a book. We'll see. Oh, thank you for
great.
That is my Twitter handle. Yeah. And I like to drop various, little tidbits from my archival research in my Twitter feed. So if you're into that sort of thing, there it is.
Well, thank you again so much, Dr. Cotlar. We really appreciate it. Stay safe, everybody. Have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you next week.
All right.
All right. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Yeah. I forgot to mention that my grandfather was a big Goldwater supporter, and he lived in Sun Lakes, Arizona at the end of his life. So anyway.
There you go. I bet we have some members who are in that area. Well, thanks again. You have a great day. Take care. Thank you. All right. Bye-bye.